Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Imagine this. Trapped in the suffocating darkness of a cave, you face a creature, its eyes glowing with an ancient, malevolent hunger. As it moves toward you, the air grows thick, your heart races, and then it speaks. What will happen next? You won't believe how this horrifying encounter ends. Stick with us till the end. You won't be able to resist the shocking conclusion. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark for more spine-chilling stories. Your support helps us bring you even more terrifying tales. David Williams had always been a man who found solace in the shadows. A psychologist by trade, a writer by passion, he had long been fascinated by the unexplainable, those fleeting moments of terror that could not be rationalized or pinned down. His work, probing the minds of those who claimed to have seen the unseeable, had earned him a modest reputation. He was a voice in the dark for those who had come face to face with the impossible, those who had encountered creatures from another world, spirits that defied understanding, and even the terrifying possibility of life after death. His writings, though, were different. They didn't seek to explain. They didn't aim to rationalize the paranormal. Instead, they drew readers deep into the darkness, leaving them wondering whether what they were reading was truth or something far more sinister. It was during one of his late nights in his office, piles of papers, half-empty coffee mugs, and a faint hum of a distant storm outside, that David received a call that would change the course of his life. The phone rang with an urgency that broke the monotony of his quiet solitude. He lifted the receiver with an automatic motion, expecting another interview request or a desperate plea from one of his less stable correspondents. What he heard, though, made his blood run cold. "Mr. Williams, I'm calling on behalf of the SARVAC, the Search and Rescue Volunteer Association." The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, yet laced with a strange tension that immediately piqued David's curiosity. "We've got a case that requires your expertise." David paused, rubbing his temples. His reputation had grown among those with strange stories to tell, but the idea of a rescue mission involving the supernatural was unheard of. "I'm listening," he replied cautiously. "The case is unusual. We've got missing persons, people who disappeared without a trace in the outskirts of Denver. Locals say they've seen something, someone, but we're not dealing with a simple disappearance. There's talk of something else." David's mind raced. He'd heard of such things before, rumors whispered in dark alleys, fleeting mentions in folklore. But to have someone from a reputable organization like SARVAC reach out, that was something new. He didn't know what to expect, but his instincts told him this was no ordinary assignment. His hand gripped the receiver tighter as the voice continued. "I understand you've interviewed similar cases in the past, creatures, entities, things people can't explain. We need you to come out here, Mr. Williams. This thing, or whatever it is, it's taken more than one life, and it's only a matter of time before it strikes again." David's pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something in the voice was raw, unguarded, as if the person on the other end had seen things that had shaken even their ironclad composure. He wasn't just intrigued anymore. He was drawn in like a moth to a flame. And just like a moth, he couldn't help but wonder what the light might cost him. "I'll be there," David said, his voice steady, though his mind was already racing ahead to what lay in the unknown. 2 days later, David found himself standing on the edge of a small, desolate clearing, the scent of rain still hanging in the air. The overcast skies above Denver hung like a heavy blanket, the world wrapped in an oppressive gray. The air felt thick, charged, as if the very land around him was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The area he had been directed to seemed quiet at first, too quiet. The kind of quiet that you couldn't ignore, where every crackling leaf and every shifting shadow felt like it was part of something much larger. He checked his equipment once more, his recorder, his notepad, his flashlight, and made his way deeper into the woods. As he ventured further, the silence began to weigh on him. There were no birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of his own footsteps crunching softly underfoot. It wasn't right. David's breath quickened, his instincts honed from years of digging into the minds of those who'd seen the unexplainable. Something about this place made him uneasy, and it wasn't just the silence. He reached the small campsite where the missing family had last been seen. There, abandoned tents and an overturned SUV lay in a scene of chaos, yet there was no blood, no clear signs of struggle. It was as if the family had simply vanished into thin air. David surveyed the scene carefully, noting the way the dirt was disturbed around the campsite. No animal tracks, no blood, just the remnants of a hurried, frantic departure. What had happened to them? And why had the police not found anything? He knelt down and noticed something odd, fresh footprints, but they didn't look human. They were too small, too erratic. They were the tracks of something or someone else. He followed the strange prints through the woods, the trees around him looming like dark sentinels. After what felt like hours, David found a small, hidden cave tucked away among the rocks. The entrance was barely visible, covered by overgrown foliage. But something about it drew him in, as if he had no choice but to follow the trail that had been left for him. David pushed aside the thick branches, his heart racing. The air grew colder as he approached, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. A chill ran down his spine as he crouched down, barely able to breathe. Inside the cave, the smell was rancid, something rotting, something decaying. He fumbled for his flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam danced across the walls, illuminating ancient carvings, faded but unmistakable, petroglyphs, depictions of hunters, of animals, and of something far more sinister. He couldn't place it, but there was something in the shapes that sent a surge of unease through him. Suddenly, the beam landed on something that made his stomach turn. A small, worn leather bag. He opened it carefully, finding the relics inside: an old compass, a water canteen, and a leather-bound book. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the yellowed pages. A title in faded ink caught his eye: The Demon. But before he could delve deeper into the book, a sound echoed from deeper within the cave. A sharp crack, the sound of something snapping, something moving. David's heart leapt into his throat as he spun around. The sound came again, closer this time. He strained his ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something, someone moving within the shadows. A sense of dread filled his chest. He wasn't alone. And then, as if the very air around him had come alive, a voice whispered from the darkness, "I'm here." David's legs trembled beneath him as he turned toward the sound, his breath shallow and quick. What had he stumbled upon? What was it that had been left to haunt this place? In the dim light of the cave he saw it, something small crouched in the shadows. Its eyes were glowing, burning with an unnatural light. For a split second, David thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved, and he saw the truth. It wasn't human, it was a creature, a thing, a vampire. David's mind raced. The book, the markings on the walls, it all started to make sense. But even as his mind connected the dots, his body refused to move. He was frozen in place, staring into the dark abyss that was alive with something ancient and terrible. The creature's lips parted, revealing teeth as sharp as knives. It tilted its head, eyes narrowing as if appraising him. And then it spoke again. This time the voice was clear. "You shouldn't have come here." As David stumbled backward, his mind unable to comprehend what was happening, one thing became certain. The nightmare he had come to uncover was just beginning. The darkness had awakened, and there was no turning back now. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the sterile room where John Doe awaited him. The low hum of fluorescent lights above only amplified the eerie silence that hung between them. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something more unsettling, like the faint trace of decay, though David knew it couldn't possibly be that. Not yet, anyway. John Doe was sitting in a metal chair, his back straight as though expecting David. He wore a faded, worn-out jacket that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital room, but it wasn't the clothes that caught David's attention. It was John Doe's skin. His complexion was ghostly pale, almost unnaturally so. His eyes, however, were what truly held David's gaze, bloodshot, like they were filled with the embers of a dying fire glowing faintly in the dim light. David felt a chill creeping up his spine, and though his rational mind screamed that there had to be an explanation for everything, a gut feeling told him that nothing about this situation was ordinary. He steeled himself, setting his notepad down on the table and looking at the man in front of him. "John," David began, his voice steady but unsure. "You've been through a lot. We're here to understand your story. Can you tell me what happened? How did you end up here?" John Doe's eyes flickered with something resembling recognition, but it was fleeting, almost as if he were calculating his next words carefully. Then, as if the weight of an unseen burden had descended on him, he spoke in a voice that was both hollow and soothing, like the distant whisper of something long forgotten. "I wasn't always this way," he said slowly, his voice carrying an unnerving calmness. "I was just like you once, ordinary, alive, but that all changed when I found it." David leaned in slightly, sensing that this was the moment everything would start to make sense. He knew John's story wouldn't be an easy one, but he had no idea just how far it would push the boundaries of belief. John continued, "I was living in Denver. I had a family, a house, a job I didn't hate. But that was before it happened. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Just whispers, strange dreams, the feeling that something was out of place. It started with an old book I found in an antique shop, tucked away in a corner where nobody would have seen it. At first, I thought it was a work of fiction, just some dusty relic of a forgotten time, but I was wrong." David watched him carefully. John's face was blank, but the intensity in his eyes grew with every word. "I didn't understand what I was dealing with. At first, I thought I was going mad, but the more I read, the more alive I felt. The book, it called to me. It spoke of something older than time, something that had existed before the world as we know it, a creature from beyond the stars. A being that fed on the blood of the living, a parasite of the highest order. It told me that I was chosen, that I was destined to become a vessel for something greater." David's mind raced, but he stayed silent, urging John to continue. "That's when I met it, the creature. I don't even know what it was, only that it was waiting for me. It came in the dead of night, its voice like the wind scraping across the earth. It didn't speak to me in the traditional sense. It whispered inside my mind. It told me that I could become something more, that I could leave behind the limitations of flesh and blood, that I could live forever." John's words sent a cold shiver down David's spine, but he refused to let his discomfort show. He had heard about strange phenomena before, but this was different. Something about John's manner, his complete lack of emotion, made David realize that this wasn't just a delusion. Something deeply disturbing was unfolding before him. "I didn't believe it at first," John said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But over time I began to feel it, the hunger, the need to feed. It wasn't a choice anymore, it became who I was. I became a part of it, a quantum vampire." David felt his throat tighten. A quantum vampire. The words felt like they had been pulled from the darkest corners of myth, but hearing them from John made them all too real. John continued, his voice cold, detached. "The vampire is not like the ones you read about in stories. It doesn't turn into a bat, doesn't sleep in a coffin. It's a parasite, something that exists in the spaces between worlds. It attaches to a host, takes over their body, and feeds until there's nothing left but the hunger. It's not just immortality that it offers. It's a whole new existence, one that transcends the limits of this physical world. It's alien." David's mind was reeling. He had heard of many things, but this was something beyond any rational explanation. A creature that existed in the spaces between worlds, feeding on the very essence of life itself. A being that was older than time. It sounded like madness, yet the emptiness in John's voice made David question everything he thought he knew about reality. John's face twisted into something close to a smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was empty, as if the man sitting before David was no longer entirely human. "I didn't ask for this, but once it takes hold of you, it doesn't let go. I've become what I am, not by choice, but by the will of something far greater than anything I could ever understand. And now it's too late to undo it." David leaned forward, his mind struggling to keep pace with the story unfolding before him. "What happened next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John stared at him, his red eyes seeming to pierce through David. "It's hunting again. It's always hunting. And now it's coming for you too." David recoiled at the sudden intensity in John's eyes. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if something unseen had just entered, a presence that pressed in on them both. The walls seemed to close in, and David could hear the faint whispering again, echoing through his thoughts like the hiss of a long-forgotten language. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to." "You can't leave," John interrupted, his voice now more of a command than a plea. "It knows you're here, it's watching." David froze, his heart hammered in his chest, and the feeling of being watched grew unbearable, suffocating. He turned towards the door, his thoughts scattered, but his body unwilling to obey. He couldn't explain it, this was madness, surely, but the fear gripping him was real. His legs shook as if they were no longer his own. "You think you're safe, don't you?" John's voice broke through the haze of panic. "But once it's seen you, once it's marked you, there's no escape. You will become one of us." The last word hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. David backed away slowly, his mind a whirl of confusion and terror. How could this be real? But something inside him, the part of him that had always trusted his instincts, whispered that it was. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a myth. This was real, and he had just opened a door that would lead him to a nightmare far worse than anything he had ever imagined. "Remember this, David," John's voice echoed, his red eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You will never escape what's coming." David fled from the room, his heart pounding in his chest as his breath came in ragged gasps. But as he rushed down the hallway, the whispers began again, louder now, filling his mind with their cold, alien words. And somewhere in the darkness that stretched beyond the edges of his vision, he could feel it, the creature, the quantum vampire, watching. It was too late to run. The night had descended with a chill that seemed to grip every breath, wrapping the forest in a darkness that was not just the absence of light, but something deeper, something suffocating. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and the stagnant hum of impending doom. David stood at the edge of the cave, his flashlight trembling in his hand as the shadows seemed to stretch farther, curling like tendrils of the unknown, waiting to pull him into their depths. The wind had ceased to whisper, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The usual rustling of the trees had fallen silent, and even the distant calls of the animals had disappeared. It was as though the entire world had gone still in anticipation of something terrible. David's heart raced as the darkness around him seemed to pulse, vibrating with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. He could feel it now, an overwhelming sense of being watched, an unseen force pressing in on him from all sides. His instincts, honed over years of studying the human mind and behavior, told him this was not just fear. This was something else, something that had been waiting, biding its time until the moment was right. And that moment, David realized with a sickening certainty, was now. Suddenly, there was movement in the shadows ahead. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. But no, there it was again. A shape, a flicker in the darkness, moving with an unnatural fluidity like smoke twisting in the wind. The sound of footsteps, barely audible, yet unmistakable, echoed through the stillness, drawing closer. And then it emerged. David's body froze. The creature that stepped from the depths of the cave was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and sinewy, with a grace that defied the laws of nature. Its skin was the color of ash, a pale, sickly hue that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But it was its eyes, those eyes, that were the most disturbing. They were black, completely devoid of any iris or sclere, just an empty void that seemed to pull in the light, swirling with an intensity that sent a wave of primal fear coursing through David's veins. The thing moved with inhuman speed, a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to track. In an instant, it was upon the group of survivors, its speed almost defying the laws of physics. One of the men standing closest to David was thrown backward with such force that he crashed into the rock wall behind him, his body crumpling like a rag doll. The others tried to react, to pull out weapons or to shout for help, but the creature was faster, its movements like lightning, and before they could even raise their arms in defense, they were all on the ground, unconscious, their bodies limp and unmoving. David stood there, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His training, his experience, everything he had learned about the human mind and the supernatural, none of it had prepared him for this. This was not a human being. It was something else entirely, something older, something that had no place in this world. It was then that the creature's lips parted, revealing teeth that were sharp, jagged, like the fangs of some ancient predator. Its mouth opened wider, as if it was savoring the terror in the air. And then it spoke, not with a voice but with a presence, as though the words themselves were being forced into David's mind, twisting his thoughts, pushing through his consciousness like a blade through flesh. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice cold and distant, as if it were speaking from a place far beyond this world. David's heart raced, his thoughts scrambled. He wanted to move, to run, to get away from this nightmare, but his body was paralyzed. The creature, this thing, was feeding, but not in the way that David had imagined. It wasn't drinking blood. It was feeding on something else, something deeper, something more insidious. It was feeding on fear, on the very essence of what made them human. And David could feel it. He could feel it inside him, crawling through his veins, curling around his thoughts like a serpent, coiling tighter and tighter with every passing second. With a sudden jolt, he snapped back to reality. His mind, though clouded by terror, screamed for him to act, to move. He ran, he had no idea where, but he ran. His legs burned with every step, the sound of his frantic breathing filling his ears. But the creature was faster, always faster. It didn't need to chase him. It was always there in his mind, in his thoughts, its presence suffocating every corner of his being. He stumbled, falling to his knees as the world around him blurred. The ground felt like it was shifting beneath him, warping and bending, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. And then, just when he thought he couldn't go any further, he saw it. The cave's walls, which had once seemed so impenetrable, now revealed their secrets. Ancient symbols, carvings from a time long forgotten, etched into the rock like a map that David instinctively knew he had to follow. These symbols were old, older than any civilization he had studied, older than any mythology he had ever encountered. And as he traced his fingers over the worn markings, he felt the energy within them, an undeniable force that surged through him like a jolt of electricity. The creature stopped. It stood in the shadows, watching David with those unblinking, soulless eyes. It seemed to sense his discovery, to realize that David was beginning to understand something that had been hidden for millennia. And in that moment, David understood something he had feared all along. This creature was not new. It wasn't some rogue monster that had stumbled into the world of humans by mistake. It had always been here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And it was connected to something far older, something buried deep within the earth itself. David didn't know how, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The creature, the vampire, it was part of something far more ancient than any of them could comprehend, and it had been awakened. David's pulse thundered in his ears as the full weight of the situation crashed over him. The ancient civilizations of South America, the long-forgotten tribes of Siberia, what if they had known about these creatures? What if they had tried to stop them but failed? What if this vampire was the tip of a much larger iceberg, a force that had been imprisoned for eons, only to be released in this very moment? The creature took a step forward, its presence looming over David like a nightmare come to life. It moved with the speed of thought, its fangs glistening in the dim light as it advanced. And for a split second, David felt something shift within him, a strange, powerful force urging him to fight, to stand his ground. But before he could react, a sound split the air, a roar, a screech, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the earth itself. The ground shook beneath their feet. David didn't know whether it was an earthquake or something more sinister, but in that moment everything changed. The walls of the cave began to crack, and as the creature snarled, a deep, guttural sound, something ancient and terrible stirred beneath the earth. The vampire froze. It knew that it was no longer alone. David sat at the desk, surrounded by a disordered mess of ancient manuscripts, books with pages so fragile they threatened to crumble at his touch, and his own notes hastily scrawled across the pages. He was diving deeper, further than he ever had before, into a subject that threatened to swallow him whole. The quantum vampire, a concept that had haunted his mind since his encounter in the cave, its meaning slipping further from his grasp with every passing hour. There were no straightforward explanations in the texts he had uncovered. They spoke of things that should not exist, of beings that defied every rule of nature, of science, of reality itself. These were not mere legends or myths told to scare children into behaving. These were ancient truths, written in the hidden corners of the world, where the light of rational thought had never dared to tread. And now, David was about to peer into those dark places, to confront the terrible reality of what lay beyond the veil, What he had found was chilling. The quantum vampire was not a vampire in the traditional sense. It was not a man in a cape, stalking the streets under the cover of night, sucking the life from unsuspecting victims. No, the quantum vampire existed beyond the constraints of space and time. It was an entity from another dimension, from a place where the very laws of reality were different. These creatures were not confined to the limits of this world. They were not bound by the familiar laws of biology and physics. Instead, they moved across dimensions, slipping in and out of different planes of existence, feeding on the energy of living beings, drawing strength from their very souls. David shuddered as he read the description of the creature. The more he learned, the more he realized just how little he understood. These beings, the quantum vampires, did not merely take the blood of their victims. They consumed something far more vital, the very essence of a person. Their souls, their memories, their consciousness. The more they fed, the more they grew. The more they were able to extend their existence beyond the boundaries of life itself. They were not creatures of flesh and bone. They were parasites of the spirit, leeching off the life force of those they possessed. Every time one of these vampires entered a new body, they did not simply occupy it, they became it. They took on the memories, the personality, the very soul of the host, blending with it until the two became indistinguishable. And when the host's body could no longer serve them, when the flesh grew too weak or too damaged, they would discard it and move on, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell, a body with the echo of a soul that was no longer its own. David felt a chill creep down his spine as the full weight of this realization sank in. The creature that had attacked him in the cave, the thing he had seen in the shadows, it was one of them, a quantum vampire, and it wasn't done. It was just the beginning. But David was not without hope. There were still secrets left to uncover, and as he scoured the ancient texts, he came across a passage that caught his eye. It spoke of an ancient prophecy, a warning that had been passed down through generations. It spoke of the return of the quantum vampires, a time when the barriers between dimensions would weaken, when the human race would begin to understand the true nature of the void that surrounded them. And it spoke of a way to stop them, to end their reign of terror. But the path was not clear. The prophecy was vague, cryptic, its meaning wrapped in layers of symbolism, as though it were meant to be hidden from all but the most determined of seekers. According to the texts, the key to stopping the quantum vampires lay not in brute force, but in understanding them. In understanding the very nature of their existence, their connection to the other dimensions, and their insatiable need to feed on the essence of life. The prophecy hinted at a weapon, a way to sever their connection to this world, to trap them in the dark void between dimensions, where they could no longer feed on the living. But there was a catch. The weapon could only be wielded by one who had already faced a quantum vampire, who had touched the very essence of the creature. Only someone who had stood on the edge of the abyss and returned would be able to wield the power to stop them. The knowledge, it seemed, was reserved for those who had already crossed the line between life and death. And David, by some twisted fate, had already taken that step. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was no longer just a passive observer in this nightmare. He was a participant, a key player in a much larger, much older conflict. The quantum vampires were not just hunting for him. They were hunting for all of humanity. And as he looked at the ancient texts, at the fragments of prophecy, he began to realize the true depth of the threat they posed. They weren't just ancient predators. They were invaders. They came from the spaces between worlds, from a place where time and space held no sway, and they had only one goal: to consume everything in their path. David's thoughts raced as he flipped through the pages of the book. The more he read, the more he felt the walls of reality pressing in on him. The barrier between this world and the next was thinning, and with each passing day, the quantum vampires were drawing closer to breaking through. But there was one thing that gave him hope. The prophecy spoke of a way to stop them, a way to trap them in the void between dimensions, where they could never again harm anyone. But it wasn't just a weapon that was needed. It was a sacrifice. The one who wielded the weapon would have to give up their connection to this world, to step into the void themselves and become a part of it forever. It was a choice between saving humanity and losing oneself to the darkness. David didn't know if he was ready for that. He didn't know if anyone could be. But he did know one thing: the quantum vampires were real. They were out there and they were coming for him. The question was no longer if they would find him. It was when. And when that time came, would he be ready to make the ultimate sacrifice? David stared at the words in front of him, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The weight of the task before him felt insurmountable, but there was no turning back now. He had seen the darkness and it had seen him. The only way out was through, and the only way to stop the quantum vampires was to face them head on. And in the dark corners of his mind, David felt the pull, the call of the void. The night was alive with the sounds of the forest, the wind whispering through the trees, the distant rustling of leaves. But beneath the natural symphony there was something else, a low, persistent hum, almost inaudible but ever-present, like the faint vibration of an unseen threat. David could feel it in his bones, an unsettling presence that gnawed at the edges of his mind. It was as if the very air around him was thickening, growing heavier with every passing second. The research camp had been quiet, far too quiet, as David and his team gathered the last of their supplies, preparing for what they thought would be a routine investigation into the local folklore. But in the back of his mind, David knew better. The knowledge he had uncovered about the quantum vampires, the creatures that lurked between worlds, had set a chain of events into motion. He could no longer deny it. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the cold wind or the creeping shadows of the forest. It was the thing he had been chasing for weeks, something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Then, without warning, the attack came. It wasn't a slow encroachment. There were no warning signs, no distant sounds of footsteps or the rustling of underbrush. One moment the camp was still, and the next, chaos erupted. The first sign of the attack was the scream, a blood-curdling, guttural sound that sliced through the quiet night air. David's heart skipped a beat. He knew that scream. It was the same scream he had heard in the cave, the scream of terror, the sound of something inhuman. Before he could react, there was another scream, followed by a violent crash. One of the tents collapsed, as if something had ripped through it with the force of a storm. The ground beneath David's feet seemed to tremble. His mind raced as he instinctively grabbed for his flashlight, but when he switched it on, the beam barely cut through the dark. The night had swallowed everything. Then he saw it, a figure moving in the shadows, too fast, too fluid. It was impossible. It wasn't a human figure. It was something else, something predatory, something that shouldn't exist. The creature moved with lightning speed, its form blurring as it passed between the trees. One of David's colleagues, Mark, let out a choked gasp as he tried to raise his weapon, but before he could fire, the creature was on him. The scream that followed was like the sound of a man being torn apart. David's body went numb. He couldn't move. His legs felt like stone. He could only watch, frozen, as the creature tore through the camp, its eyes glowing like burning coals in the dark. It moved so fast, so effortlessly, that it was more like a shadow than a physical being. Its form flickered and shifted with each passing second, as if it were something not entirely bound by the laws of nature. It was a monster, but it was not human. It was something older, something beyond. Panic set in. His instincts kicked in and David turned to run. But it was too late. He wasn't fast enough. The creature had already turned its attention to him, its gaze locking onto him with a terrifying intensity. He felt the cold chill of its presence wash over him like the very air had turned to ice. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape it. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees looming like silent witnesses to his inevitable doom. But then something strange happened. In the chaos, in the madness of the attack, David caught a glimpse of something else. A figure, human but not quite. A man emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing with the confidence of someone who knew this forest, who knew this darkness. David's heart skipped as he saw the man's eyes, black as coal, with a burning red hue that glowed like embers. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his movements were unnaturally fluid. He walked toward the creature without hesitation, as though he were not afraid, as though he were something else entirely. David tried to call out to warn the man, but his voice caught in his throat. The creature turned its attention toward the newcomer, but there was something different about this man. The creature seemed to hesitate, as if sensing something in him, something it could not understand. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice deep and cold, yet strangely familiar. The creature hissed, a sound like nails scraping across metal. It lunged, but the man stepped forward, moving with the same unnatural speed. In an instant, he had grabbed the creature by the throat, lifting it off the ground with ease. The creature's eyes flared, its fangs bared, but it was powerless in the man's grip. David watched in stunned silence. The man seemed to be holding the creature back, not with physical strength, but with something else, something David couldn't quite comprehend. It was as though the very fabric of reality itself bent around the man, obeying his will. With a final, violent twist, the man slammed the creature into the ground, pinning it there with a force that shook the very earth beneath their feet. David stood frozen, his mind trying to process what he had just seen. Who was this man? What was he? The man turned slowly, his eyes locking with David's. There was no warmth in them, no humanity, just an endless void, as if he were staring into the depths of something that had long since lost its soul. "Little Crow," the man whispered, his voice carrying a weight of dread that made David's blood run cold. "That's what they called me, before it all happened." David took a step back, his mind reeling. Little Crow. He had heard the name before in the ancient texts he had uncovered. The legend of a boy who had been brought back from the dead, only to become a vessel for something far darker than any human could understand. But this was no legend, this was real, and this man, this thing, was Little Crow. Little Crow's lips curled into a twisted smile, one that made David's stomach churn. "I was once human," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp, "but that was before the stars spoke to me, before the darkness came and took me. Now I am what they made me." David could hardly comprehend the words. His mind struggled to keep up with the horror unfolding before him. The creature, this quantum vampire, was not just a mindless predator. It was a creature of intelligence, of ancient power, and it had been waiting for David, waiting for him to uncover the truth. "But why?" David asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you helping us?" Little Crow's eyes flickered with something that could have been amusement, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm not helping you, David. I'm saving you. You think you're fighting for survival, but you've already lost. The game has already begun, and there's no way out. Not for you, not for anyone." David felt a cold shiver run through him, and for the first time he realized the full scope of what he was up against. The creatures, the quantum vampires, they weren't just a threat to this world. They were something much larger, something that had been waiting for the right moment to invade, and that moment was now. "You want to stop them." Little Crow's voice was almost a whisper now. "You'll have to do something more than just fight. You'll have to become one of us." David's blood ran cold at the implication. He didn't understand. How could he? He wasn't ready to give in, to lose himself to the darkness. But Little Crow's words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him like a poison. The battle for survival was far from over, and David knew, deep down, that it was just the beginning. The wind howled across the desolate mountain peaks, carrying with it a biting cold that seemed to cut straight through David's layers of clothing. He stood at the edge of the ravine, staring into the abyss below, his breath heavy and labored in the thin air. The weight of the situation bore down on him, a pressure that was no longer just physical, but psychological. His mind felt like it was unraveling with every passing second, torn between the overwhelming desire to fight and the creeping sense of hopelessness that gnawed at his resolve. David was no longer the observer. He was a participant in something far larger than himself, a war that had been raging for millennia, long before humanity ever had the capacity to understand it. The quantum vampires were not just creatures that had stumbled into this world. They had been waiting, watching, and manipulating history from the shadows. Now, the veil had been lifted, and the true battle had begun. David and his team had spent the last few days piecing together the fragments of ancient texts, reports from survivors, and relics from long-forgotten civilizations. It had become clear. These creatures were not merely beasts. They were invaders, alien entities that existed beyond the confines of space and time, slipping between dimensions with ease. They had infiltrated every corner of human history, manipulating empires and civilizations, feeding on the life force of entire societies. But they were not invincible. The texts, buried deep in the archives of long-lost civilization, spoke of a time when these creatures had been fought before. In ancient South America, in the heart of Siberia, and in the frozen wastes of the Himalayas, these vampires had faced resistance from those who had glimpsed the truth of their existence. The Aztecs, the Mongols, the lost tribes of the ancient world, they had all fought against the vampires in their own way, and they had lost. But now, David understood something that the ancients had not. The key to defeating them wasn't brute force. It was knowledge. Understanding the true nature of these invaders and how to sever their connection to the human world was the only hope. David's fingers tightened around the map he had found in the ruins of an old temple. It was an ancient star chart, one that had been carved into the stone centuries ago by a civilization that had long since been wiped from existence. The map depicted the stars in a configuration that was unlike anything David had ever seen. At the center of the chart was a symbol, an intricate pattern that resembled an eye, its pupil a spiraling vortex. The symbol had appeared in every ancient text he had uncovered. It was always the same, always a warning. "This is it," David muttered, his voice a low rasp as he traced the symbol with his finger. "This is where they came from." The others gathered around him, their eyes fixed on the map. Sarah, his most trusted ally, spoke first. "You're saying these creatures, they came from another dimension, another world?" David nodded. "Yes, they're not of this earth. They're beings from beyond the fabric of our reality. They exist between dimensions, slipping through the cracks when the barriers weaken. They can't be killed the way we think of death. They feed on our energy, on our souls, and they are waiting." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, as the realization set in that they were not dealing with an ordinary enemy. These creatures were not just predators. They were invaders, beings that had existed for longer than humanity could comprehend, and the only way to stop them was to learn how to fight them in their own realm. "But how do we fight them?" Michael, another member of the team, asked, his voice shaking slightly. "They've been here for thousands of years. They've seen everything. What chance do we have?" David's eyes hardened, a flicker of determination passing through them. "We fight them by taking away what they need to survive. We sever their connection to this world. The prophecy spoke of a weapon, a way to trap them in the space between dimensions, but we have to act quickly. We have to believe we can win, even if it seems impossible." The team nodded grimly, each of them knowing that the odds were slim, but there was no other choice. They had no other plan, no other way to escape the nightmare that was closing in on them. That night, as the team settled in for what would be their final night before the battle, David couldn't sleep. His mind raced with the weight of the coming fight. He had seen the creature, he had felt its presence. He knew that the war was no longer a battle between humanity and an ancient predator. It was a fight for the very soul of the world itself. He stood up from his cot and walked to the edge of the camp, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The sky above was dark, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds that had settled in. It was as though the very heavens were hiding from the coming storm. As David stared into the night, a memory surfaced in his mind, a memory from his childhood. He had always been drawn to the dark corners of the world, fascinated by stories of the supernatural, of creatures that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. But now, standing on the edge of this war, he realized just how unprepared he had been. He had thought he understood fear, thought he understood the unknown. But this was something else entirely. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. It was faint at first, a low hum like the sound of a distant engine. But as the sound grew louder, David's heart began to race. It wasn't an engine, it was something else, something alive. From the depths of the forest he saw them, a swarm of shapes too many to count, moving in perfect synchrony. They were coming for him, the quantum vampires. David's breath caught in his throat. They had found them. The final battle had begun. He turned and ran back to the camp, shouting for the others. But as he reached the clearing, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of something unseen, something ancient and deadly. And then, without warning, the night exploded into chaos. The vampires were upon them. But this time they were not alone. They had brought with them an army of otherworldly creatures that David had never seen before. They were not human, nor were they anything that belonged to this world. Their bodies were like shadows, shifting and twisting, their forms barely distinguishable from the night itself. They moved with terrifying speed, their eyes glowing with a sickly green light, and their mouths gaped wide, revealing rows of teeth that were too many and too sharp. David's team fought back with everything they had. Guns fired, flashes of light illuminated the darkness, and the air was filled with the sounds of struggle and chaos. But it was no use. The creatures were too strong, too fast. They moved through the gunfire as if it didn't even touch them. They were unstoppable. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, a voice echoed through the chaos. It was Little Crow, standing in the center of the battlefield, his eyes glowing like the fires of hell. "They cannot win," he shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield like a command. "They are already dead." With a flick of his hand, a barrier of light erupted from the ground, encasing him and the creatures in a circle of energy. The battle paused as both sides turned to face him. Little Crow's face was twisted in a grimace, but his eyes were filled with something else, something darker. "We are the darkness that swallows all light," he said, his voice rising in power. "And there is no place for you in this world." David's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Little Crow unleash a power unlike anything he had ever seen. A wave of energy as dark as the void itself spread from him, and in an instant everything shifted. His creatures fell to their knees, their bodies writhing in pain. The light around them flickered, dimming with every passing second. David knew what he had to do. He had to act quickly before the darkness consumed them all. The battle for survival had just begun, and there was no turning back. David could feel his heart racing, a wild thunder in his chest that mirrored the violent chaos of the world around him. The air was thick, dense with the weight of the unknown. It was as if time itself had fractured, bending under the pressure of something far older, far darker than anything David had ever encountered. The battle had been relentless, a war fought in the shadows, where every step forward felt like a step into a deeper, colder void. And now, as the final confrontation loomed on the horizon, David was no longer just a man. He was something else, caught in the undertow of an ancient conflict, unable to escape, unable to wake from the nightmare that had consumed his every waking moment. He had seen things, unseen forces, creatures beyond the comprehension of mortal minds, and the darkness had touched him. But nothing had prepared him for what awaited him in the heart of this war. He had faced creatures that defied the laws of nature, beings that existed between worlds, feeding on the very essence of life. But there was one figure in this tale who had haunted him above all others, John Doe, the man who was no man at all, the creature who had once been human but now carried within him the monstrous curse of the quantum vampire. David had seen the depths of John's transformation, the way the darkness had seeped into his soul, turning him into something other, something unrecognizable. Yet, even knowing this, David had never truly grasped the extent of the horrors that John had become, until now. It was the perfect storm of dread. Time and space seemed to warp around them, as though the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel in the presence of something that should not exist. They stood in a cavernous, hollow place where the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, echoing with the heartbeat of a world on the brink of collapse. The air was thick with dust and blood, with echoes of screams that had long since faded into silence. David had entered this place with one goal in mind: to stop John, to stop the quantum vampire before it consumed everything. But as he stared into the abyss, as the darkness pressed in around him, David realized that he wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting for the survival of humanity itself. "You know this was always inevitable." John's voice cut through the stillness, cold and familiar like a serpent whispering in his ear. "You've seen it, haven't you? You feel it, the pull, the hunger. It was always in you, David. You were always meant to become like me." David's breath caught in his throat. His hand clenched around the weapon in his grip, a makeshift blade he had forged from an ancient relic. It was supposed to be the key, the weapon that could sever the connection between the quantum vampires and the human world. But even as he held it, a part of him, deep down, wondered if this would be enough. Would anything be enough? John stepped forward, his movements smooth, too fluid, like water flowing through cracks in the earth. His eyes glowed red, the pupils black as midnight, hollow and empty, yet brimming with a malevolent hunger that seemed to pierce David's very soul. There was no humanity left in those eyes, just the cold, insatiable darkness of the creature he had become. "You're too late," John said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can stop this. You think you can destroy us, when you've already seen what we are. You've touched the darkness, David, and now you'll never escape it." David's mind reeled, the weight of John's words sinking in like an anchor. He had felt it, the darkness. It had wormed its way into his thoughts, wrapping around his mind like a vice, tightening with every passing moment, but he couldn't let it win. He wouldn't. He stepped forward, his legs unsteady but determined, his grip tightening on the weapon. "You're wrong," David said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "You're not invincible, you're not eternal, you're just a parasite, a thing that preys on the living because it has nothing else. But you can be stopped. You will be stopped." John's lips twisted into a cruel smile, and for a moment David could see the faintest flicker of something that almost resembled the man John had once been. But it was fleeting, gone in an instant. "Fool, you think you can fight this? Fight me. There is no escape from what I am, from what we all are. We are the darkness. We are the end. Asterisk." The words struck David like a slap to the face, but even as they hit him, something inside him, something deeper, something primal, pushed back against the terror, against the suffocating weight of John's words. He had come too far. He had sacrificed too much to let it all slip away now. With a surge of adrenaline, David lunged forward, slashing with the blade. The weapon cut through the air with a sharp hiss, the metal glinting in the dim light. But John was faster, his movements blurring, almost impossible to track. The blade missed, and David barely had time to react before John was on him, his hand gripping David's throat with an ironclad grip. David gasped for breath, his vision swimming as John's cold, dead eyes locked onto his. "Do you feel it, David?" John hissed, his voice low and guttural. "The pull, the hunger, the darkness is inside you now. It will always be. You can't escape it. You are one of us." David fought against the pressure, his hands clawing at John's grip. His mind screamed for a way out, for something, anything, that could save him. The weapon, the relic, it was his only chance. With one last burst of strength, David twisted his body and plunged the weapon into John's side, feeling the cold metal scrape against bone. John let out a howl of rage, his grip loosening just enough for David to break free. Blood, black as tar, oozed from the wound, but John only smiled, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "You think that will stop me?" John growled, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you can destroy me with a mere trinket? I am beyond death. I am eternal, and you're just another stepping stone on the path to the end of this world." David backed away, his heart pounding, his mind scrambling for answers. He had no more strength left, no more will to fight. He could feel it. The darkness was closing in, suffocating him, overwhelming him. And for a brief moment he thought he might lose himself to it. But then something strange happened. A light, faint at first, began to glow in the distance. It wasn't much, just a flicker in the dark, but it was enough. Enough to remind David that he wasn't alone, that he hadn't come this far just to give up. The light grew brighter, growing in intensity until it blazed like a beacon, piercing the darkness. And in that light, David saw it, a figure. A woman standing tall and proud, her face filled with an otherworldly calm. She held out her hand toward David, her eyes meeting his with a knowing gaze. "You've done well, David," she said softly. "But this is not the end. You have the power to stop him, to stop all of them." David's mind swirled with confusion, but the light filled him with a sense of calm, of clarity. It was as though the darkness could no longer touch him. He knew, deep within, that this was his moment, his chance to finally end it, to stop the quantum vampires once and for all. With one final, desperate cry, David plunged the weapon into John's chest, its glowing tip sinking into the heart of the creature, and with it, a pulse of energy rippled through the cavern. John screamed, a sound so primal and full of rage that it shook the very ground beneath them. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness vanished. The creature dissolved into dust, leaving nothing behind but the faintest trace of something other, a whisper of an ancient evil that had finally been silenced. David collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. The quantum vampires were still out there, and one day they would return. But for now, David had won, and that was enough. The battle was over. The creature, John, or what was left of him, had been vanquished, reduced to dust and ashes. The cavern was silent now, the heavy air of malevolent energy dissipating like smoke in the wind. But as David looked around at the devastation, the remnants of his team lying in a pile of exhaustion and disbelief, he realized that the silence didn't mean peace. It meant something worse. The darkness had vanished in an instant, but its presence was still palpable in the corners of his mind, in the edges of the room. The abyss that had opened up inside him, the one that had been filled with dread, with the raw hunger of the creature, was still there, lurking, waiting. And though the threat seemed to have subsided, David couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. The war, he realized, was far from over. The light had pierced through the dark, sure, but it hadn't eradicated the source. The very fabric of reality had been stretched, torn, and pulled into realms no human mind could fully comprehend. What had been unleashed into this world was only a fragment of something larger, something older. David stood at the entrance of the cavern, his eyes scanning the forest beyond. The trees stood in silent witness to the horrors that had occurred here, but there was no relief in the stillness, no moment of quiet respite. There was only the gnawing realization that the fight was far from over. As David stepped out into the night, his mind was clouded with doubt. He hadn't expected the victory to feel this hollow. The creatures, the quantum vampires, had been vanquished, yes, but what of the truth they carried with them? What of the endless nightmare that had been awakened and threatened to swallow humanity whole? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind him. "We're not done yet." Sarah's voice was ragged, raw with exhaustion and something else, something that was harder to pinpoint. But it was there in her words, in her tone. It was the same thing he felt, a deep unease that could not be shaken. David turned to see her standing a few paces away, her face pale but resolute. She was alive but not unchanged. There was a certain darkness in her eyes now, one that mirrored his own. "I know," he replied, his voice thick with the weight of their shared experience. "But what now? What's left to fight?" She took a deep breath and stepped closer. "I don't know, but we're not the same as we were. These things, these vampires, they leave a mark. We've seen something we can't unsee. And no matter what we do, no matter how much we fight, that mark will always be there, on us, in us." David nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words settle deep into his bones. It was true. They had seen it, the otherness, the alien horror that existed beyond the veil of reality. And no matter how hard they tried to push it out, to destroy it, it would remain. The darkness wasn't just a physical entity. It was a presence that had seeped into their very souls. They had won, yes, but at what cost? As the days passed, David and the surviving members of his team tried to process the aftermath. They collected the bodies of those lost in the battle, the friends and colleagues who had fallen to the darkness. The remains were little more than empty vessels, their life force drained, their bodies mutilated by the creatures. They were no longer just victims. They were reminders of the price of their involvement in this war. But it wasn't just the bodies that haunted David. They had found the journal, the old, tattered book that had once belonged to John. It was filled with cryptic writings, with notes about the creatures, about their origins, their existence in the spaces between worlds. But there was something else in the journal that caught David's attention, a passage that seemed to shift, to change, as he read it. It wasn't like the rest of the text, static and unyielding. This was fluid, ever-changing, as if it was still being written in real time, still alive. David couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the journal was a warning about the future. The creatures they had faced were not gone. They were only hiding, and the war had never truly ended. As he sat in the dim light of the makeshift campfire, flipping through the pages of the journal, he came across a chilling line. "The darkness is not a place. It is a force. And forces, once unleashed, cannot be contained." David slammed the book shut, his heart racing in his chest. The words echoed in his mind, repeating like a mantra. Once unleashed, cannot be contained. It wasn't just the vampires that had been set free. It was the darkness itself. And that darkness had only been momentarily pushed back, not defeated. It was still out there, waiting, watching waiting for the moment when the walls of reality would crack again and the creatures would return. David was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Sarah standing there, her face etched with the same lines of fatigue, but also something else. Something he hadn't seen before. There was fear in her eyes, fear of what they had unleashed, fear of what they had yet to face. "We've got to find a way to stop them," she said quietly, her voice hoarse, "before they come back." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "We will. But how do you stop something that doesn't belong here? How do you stop something that's been here longer than us, that exists outside our understanding?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the edge of the camp, looking out at the horizon where the first rays of dawn were just beginning to pierce the darkness. The world was still, too still, the kind of stillness that preceded a storm. "We've got to find the source," Sarah said finally, her voice steady but resolute. "We've got to find where it all began. If we can understand where they came from, maybe we can find a way to end it for good." David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew she was right. The answers were out there, buried in the ruins of ancient civilizations, in the forgotten corners of the world. The darkness they had faced hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. It had a beginning, a source. And if they were to have any hope of ending it, they had to find it. The problem, however, was that the darkness wasn't just a thing of the past. It was still here, still moving in the shadows. And every day they delayed, every moment they spent trying to understand what had happened, the more dangerous it became. David clenched his fists, his mind racing with the implications of everything they had uncovered. They had uncovered the truth, yes, but now they had to act. They had to confront the darkness head-on, and they had to do it before it came back for them. He stood up slowly, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him like a vice. "We start tomorrow," David said, his voice low but determined. "We find the source and we end this." And though he tried to shake the growing sense of dread that clung to him, David couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. The feeling that no matter how hard they tried, they were fighting a battle they could never win. The darkness was already here. It had always been here, and there was no escaping it. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The remnants of the creatures were still out there, lurking in the cracks between worlds. And the only way to stop them was to delve deeper into the darkness than they ever had before, to find the heart of the evil they had unleashed. But that, David knew, was where the real nightmare began. The morning after the battle felt wrong. The air was too still, too silent, as if the world was holding its breath. David stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes staring into the horizon, where the first light of dawn barely broke through the thick, oppressive fog that had settled like a weight over the land. He had expected relief, something, anything to mark the end of the nightmare they had faced. But there was none. Instead, there was only an echo. The remnants of the creatures they had fought, the quantum vampires, lingered in the darkness. Even with the deaths they had caused, even with the brief moment of victory they had claimed, David knew that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The darkness, he realized, could never truly be eradicated. It had existed long before they had come into this world, and it would exist long after they were gone. It was an ancient force, older than time itself, a darkness that had been born from the deepest corners of existence, from the spaces between the stars, where the laws of reality held no sway. The creatures, these vampires from another realm, were not bound by the same rules. They could not be killed, not in the way David had once believed. Their existence was too vast, too intertwined with the fabric of the universe. Killing one or even a dozen was merely a temporary reprieve, a flicker of light in an eternal night. David's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag as the thought settled in his mind. It was inevitable. They would return. They always did. The shadows that had been banished from this world would find a way back, creeping through the cracks in reality, just waiting for the right moment to slip through once more. David. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but carrying a weight of her own. He turned to see her standing a few feet behind him, her face weary, her eyes dark with the same realization that had begun to settle like a cold stone in his chest. She didn't have to say anything. He could see it in her face. She understood. "I thought we had finished this," she said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion but laced with the determination that had carried her through the nightmare. "We killed it. We destroyed them." David shook his head slowly, the words catching in his throat as he finally turned to face her fully. "It's not over," he whispered. "We've only scratched the surface. The creatures we fought, they weren't the end. They're just the beginning." Sarah's face twisted with confusion, then understanding. "You're saying they'll come back?" David nodded, the weight of the truth pressing down on him with a suffocating force. "They always do. They've been here for millennia. Every time they've been pushed back, they find a way to return. And now they know we're ready. They'll find a way to slip through again, only this time they won't be as weak. They've been waiting for this moment, for us." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine, her breath catching in her throat as she processed his words. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. "But we've seen what they can do. How can we possibly stop them again?" David's voice faltered for a moment, the doubt creeping into his mind even as he tried to project confidence. "I don't know, but I know this: the fight isn't over. It's never over. We've opened the door, Sarah. We've touched the darkness, and now we have to deal with the consequences." The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, until it became unbearable. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for some unseen force to act. The trees stood motionless, their branches like skeletal hands reaching up toward the sky, and the air felt thick, heavy with the lingering presence of something beyond the natural world. As the days passed, the unease grew. They had returned to the small, isolated town at the edge of the forest, their camp abandoned for the time being. But even here, in the relative safety of civilization, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't just the memories of the battle that haunted him. It was the knowledge that the creatures, the quantum vampires, were still out there, waiting. Their presence lingered in the space between his thoughts, a constant reminder that the war was far from over. At night he could hear it. The whispering. It wasn't in his head. It was real. The faintest echo of voices, just on the edge of his perception, like a dream trying to push through the veil of sleep. The air itself seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, as if the world itself were alive, breathing in time with some cosmic force that David could not begin to understand. The journal, John's journal, sat on the desk in front of him, its pages still worn and stained with the remnants of the past. David had read through it a dozen times, each time discovering something new, something more unsettling. There were references to other dimensions, to the places between worlds where the creatures had come from, but there were also mentions of something worse, something darker. The final pages were torn, the words cut off as if something, had deliberately shredded the end of the story. But the final sentence, what remained of it, was the one that David couldn't shake. It haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "And when the darkness returns, it will not be as a whisper, It will come as a storm, and no one will be left to stop it. He could feel it. The storm was coming. The creatures would find a way to return, and when they did, they would be stronger. They would be ready. And this time, David wasn't sure they would survive. The truth had become clear. They had won, yes, but in doing so, they had awakened something far worse. The quantum vampires were not just creatures from another world. They were harbingers of something deeper, something older. They were the shadows that had always lingered, waiting for the right time to emerge. And the time was now. David's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He looked up, startled, as Sarah entered the room, her face grim, her eyes filled with an unease that mirrored his own. "It started," she said, her voice tight with fear. David's heart sank as he saw the look in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "The whispers, they're getting louder. People are starting to talk. Strange things are happening. People are going missing again. It's like they're calling to us." David stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for too long. He felt the weight of the moment settle over him, the realization that they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their very existence. "They're coming back," he said quietly, the words heavy on his tongue. "And this time we won't be able to stop them." As Sarah stepped forward, her expression hardening with resolve, David felt a shiver of fear crawl down his spine. The storm was coming, and they were caught in its path. But this time there was no running, no hiding. The darkness had returned, and this time it would not be so easy to defeat. The tale we've just witnessed is a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that can lie just beneath the surface of our reality. The battle between David and the quantum vampires was not just a physical confrontation. It was a fight for the very essence of life, for humanity's survival against an ancient darkness that had always existed in the shadows. Even though the vampires were defeated in the end, the truth remained. The darkness is never truly gone. It only hides, waits, and when the time is right, returns. What David's journey teaches us is that sometimes the greatest battles we face aren't against external forces, but against the fear and doubts that reside within ourselves. The vampires represent the hidden fears, the old wounds, and the unresolved pasts that we all carry within us. They come to life when we ignore them, when we avoid confronting them. And just as in David's case, the true fight is in understanding these fears, facing them head-on, and refusing to let them control our lives. The lesson here is clear. The darkness never fully disappears. It is a part of us, and it will always resurface unless we actively choose to confront it. The key to surviving this internal war is not to run, not to fight blindly, but to learn, adapt, and most importantly, to accept and understand the darkness within us. Only then can we make peace with it, disarm it, and live our lives free from its paralyzing grip. Your thoughts. What do you think of the story? Do you believe that the darkness we face in life is inevitable, or is it something we can truly conquer? Leave your comments below and let's discuss. Your insights matter, and together we can learn from each other's experiences. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark to support our channel. Your support motivates us to bring you more thought-provoking, chilling stories and deeper insights in the future. Thank you.